Hello everybody, we're back. We're going to talk about images and narratives. This is lecture 3.3. So continuing this idea of stereotyping and how stereotyping affects us, how stimuli in the environment affect us, and this triggers narratives, and that's where I want to go with this in images. You know, it's funny, since I started teaching Psych of Emotion a couple of years ago, the concept of narrative is really being brought home as it relates to emotional experience. And it reminds me of research that I did in 2001, and I'm going to talk about that in this lecturette as well. So let's get started here. Images in social psychology and sociological context, and maybe even political science. A guy named Cottrell back in the 60s started developing this idea of image theory. I learned largely about image theory from our very own Rick Herman in the political science department, Michelle Alexander, and my own advisor in social psych, Marilyn Brewer. So we'll talk about each of them. What is it? An image is a cohesive set of information about a stimuli that's established over time, and this can be done via media of all types, magazines and books, social media, television and movies, news sources. All of these introduce information that can be incorporated into images and narratives. We're talking images first, though. Images affect our perception, our thoughts, our judgment, our motion, and especially our visceral reactions. And you say, well, what the hell is a visceral reaction? And this has been part of the problem in teaching Psych of Emotion. I've become less and less clear of what actually an emotion is every semester that I teach that course, which is a good thing because it's inspiring, you know, further thought rather than closing thought because, oh, I figured it out. No, I'm continuing to explore the idea. The visceral reaction is a bodily reaction. When you think of, let's say, an emotion is disgust, when we portray disgust on the face, what do we see? And you can do this. You can imagine, let's say that you're opening up this horrible diaper that needed to be changed a long time ago, and it's there, and you open this up and you go, oh, and notice the nose actually tries to close up. You rock back to increase your distance from the smell, and this is a great example of a visceral reaction. It's not even an emotion yet. It's just this reaction to an unpleasant stimulus, right? And so the visceral reaction, I think, is going to be important in understanding much of what's linked to prejudice in certain ways. Now, images are constructed to explain, predict the behavior of both in-group and out-group. So you see, images is really kind of another type of category as it's going to be presented in image theory. So image theory then explains intergroup behaviors. And let's look at, I'm going to do this backwards than the way I generally teach it. I want to start with an image. That is the image of an ally. So if we're in World War II and the United States is looking around and we see Great Britain, well, Great Britain is an ally. Why is it an ally? Great Britain had similar goals. We've got to stop Nazism, right? It's got a similar culture. In fact, British culture and American culture are really, really closely aligned. And we look at for example, our legal system, you know, really derived out of British common law as we are in the United States. So we understand the Brits, where they come from, because they're so damn similar to us. The biggest problem is probably the language. What did Winston Churchill say? Two countries separated by a common language, which is kind of funny. And note that Great Britain and the United States at the onset of the war probably were of relative equal power. Obviously, the United States had a huge amount of capacity to become the most powerful nation in the world as a result of World War II, although some people might suggest the Soviet Union remained more powerful. Hard to know. Now, the enemy image, right, is an image that has a similar culture, and we can look at Germany then. The cultural heritage of Germany is not tremendously dissimilar from the United States. Germany was of approximate equal power at some point, but their goals were very dissimilar, and that was pretty clear. You know, when Hitler said, today Germany, tomorrow the world, the rest of the world kind of goes, well, maybe not. You know, I don't know if I like the sound of that, right? So we see then, and we tell stories based on this image of Nazi Germany as an enemy. I think it's fascinating now. Here we are in 2020. If we go back to 2010, we see that Russia, you know, former Soviet Union, kind of remained largely an enemy. The Cold War is still being played out. We still have missiles pointed at each other. We have NATO versus the Eastern Bloc. It wasn't until 2016 or 2017 that suddenly Russia is no longer perceived as an enemy, at least by people in power, and that seems very strange to a lot of us who've grown up our whole lifetime seeing the Soviet Union and subsequently Russia as someone to be concerned about, right? So the enemy then, the barbarian image, if we look in World War II, might be what we see as the Soviet Union. They have a dissimilar culture. We don't understand embracing communism as it was, and they didn't actually embrace communism anyway. It was just another authoritarian, totalitarian state led by Stalin. But they have a dissimilar culture. We don't understand where they're coming from or what they're about, you know. They have dissimilar goals. They want to do different things in the world that interfere with what we want to get done, and they had greater power. And if we look at the end of World War II, the Soviet Union had the largest standing army, and it was of great concern to us. About the only thing some people suggest that kept the Soviet Union in check at the end of World War II was the fact that we possessed the nuclear technology that they had yet to develop. And people argue about that up one side and down the other. Not too important to our conversation. So an image is a type of stereotype, and it implies an emotional response and an action tendency. And some theorists of emotion, and this is kind of the camp that you could maybe largely place me in, is that emotions are linked to an action tendency. And simply put, there's really three action tendencies that are available to us. We can approach, we can avoid, that is, we can back up, or we can remain stationary. And it's pretty easy to tie most emotional states to one of those three action tendencies. So the idea of image theory was to put all this together. That is, here's the image of the person based on the three points: the culture similarity, the goal similarity, and the power similarity. We do an evaluation of a target on those three lines. We assign them an image, and then, of course, that generates a set of stereotypes. That is, what is appropriate action and what would we likely feel. So the images and the resultant action tendencies, and here's some folks there. You see Richard Herman. So if you've taken political science, maybe you've been fortunate enough down at the Mershon Center to take a class with Richard Herman. If you can, I would. An amazing thinker and well respected throughout the international community, right? Michelle Alexander, rest in peace, passed away at a very young age of cancer and had a real promising career. Another one taken from us by the Big C. And Marilyn Brewer, I don't know what to say. All I have is a tremendous amount of respect and thanks for Dr. Brewer. She was my dissertation advisor. She was my advisor for my last 3.5 years at OSU Social Psych. And I just can't say enough about Marilyn. Brilliant human being, right? And an amazingly effective researcher, a great advisor. There's not much that couldn't be said. The one thing I will say about Marilyn, if you didn't want to hear the truth, then don't ask her the question, because she said whatever the hell was on her mind, and generally was like about 90% right on the money when she did. So their work together kind of brought image theory from political science and sociology straight into social psychology. We work with an ally to achieve mutually benefit goals and experience security and safety. So we approach an ally, right, to work on our mutually beneficial goals, and the emotion that's evoked, and I don't know if you want to consider this emotion or not because it's debatable, but as a sensation, a sense of safety or security. Maybe that's more visceral than emotional. If you really want to get into the nuances, I want you to take Psych of Emotion with me. Fall and spring for that class, right? We approach an enemy to do battle, right? And notice, isn't this strange? Because this is someone I don't like, but I approach, and this is largely a function of anger, is often an approach emotion. Strange, right? Because happiness is an approach emotion too. So this is why some of us don't dwell in positive versus negative emotions, but dwell in approach or avoid emotions, right? So we approach an enemy to do battle or compete in general if it's another organization, if we're talking in the context of business, right? And we experience usually anger and aggression. The barbarian group, because they're stronger than us and we might have limited understanding of what motivates them or where they're coming from, might generate fear and thus avoidance. Now, there's other images as well, and if you want to study image theory, go for it. This is as far as I'm taking it here. So we have images that imply emotions that also are linked to behaviors. Let's take that point away. That's the takeaway. I want to switch to the discussion in narratives now. And narratives, right, are a story that largely the mechanism that's used to create, support, and maintain the images. So narrative, right, allows us to develop this image. We take our beliefs, our attitudes, our evidence, our opinions, we craft that into a narrative that thus supports the image. And I'm going to show you a little bit how this works, right? So narratives are stories about the way the world works, and in this context, more specifically, what they, because I'm talking about person images or group images, what they are like and what they are likely to do. So images facilitate understanding and facilitate predictive behaviors associated with this outgroup. Narratives really largely come from our culture and our history, much like stereotypes, right? It's just something in which we're born, and then we choose to believe or not. Well, we probably automatically believe and necessarily have to choose to disbelieve. So narratives come from our culture or history, and they shape our present and our future. That's the stories we live by, if you want to use kind of that cliche idea. Let's challenge one. When I grew up, we had Columbus Day. We would have celebrations in grade school, and this is the 1960s, right, about Columbus. Half my family was for Columbus, and notice that narratives, in fact, are often competing. So when we look at the genocide in Rwanda, we see the Hutus and Tutsis had very different narratives about their relationship with each other. And interestingly, there's been a lot of research done there that the reconciliation of the Hutus and the Tutsis has been a fascinating process, and some people suggest that the adoption of a common narrative is what's required for people to come back together after they've been divided by war, etc. But that's an aside, but it demonstrates to a certain extent the importance of narratives. So when we talk about competing and evolving narratives, competing narratives imply different ways of being in the world, that is, for these groups of people, and I'm going to keep returning to that term, so you're probably going to get sick of the being in the world term, right? And are tightly tied to the images we hold of ourselves and others. So the narratives, again, support the images, and the images then lead to approach and avoidance tendencies and emotional reactions, guiding those action tendencies. So narratives are largely built on a system of beliefs, and now if we return to the idea of beliefs as possessions, what does that imply for the evolution of a narrative? And we can begin to think how difficult it might be to restructure narratives, to have narratives evolve into a new narrative. Because if beliefs are possessions, then there might be a tremendous incentive to hold on to our existing narrative because it really explains our world to us and does a lot to diminish our uncertainty. If we adopt a new narrative, then we are moving into a realm of uncertainty. And if there's one thing most human beings don't like, is the experience of uncertainty and the anxiety that accompanies it. So I want to talk about a little research we did that studied how narratives evolve. And I got involved in this narrative. I was in the social cog research group. We meet every Wednesday, and I remember one midday, we're getting ready and to hear someone's presentation on some research they've been doing. And Dr. Von Hippel and Dr. Brewer both said, hey, can we make an announcement before we begin? And of course, they can make an announcement because they're in charge of the deals. And they said, we're looking for a volunteer to help us do some research studying white supremacists on the internet. And I've always been interested in computers and internet, and I have an interest in white supremacists, so it was like a slam dunk, and I volunteered. And the old advice, never volunteer for anything, is probably the best advice you can follow. I ended up going down a 2-year project that was hugely time-consuming and actually led to no publications, but that's another story. That's an aside, right? But back then, publications to me were kind of on my radar and important. So we're going to explore social media, the transmission and maintenance of narratives. So research alert here, that's what we're going to be talking about. This is some stuff I pulled off the presentation. My presentation title is this little tiny one here that said Exploration of Stereotypes in the Internet Communication of White Supremacists. And I remember when I was ready to go and I developed my talk, and Von Hippel said, if you use that title, no one's going to frickin' come to your talk. And I'm saying, what? And he says, you got to put a little pizzazz in your title. You got to use something that captures people's attention. So he said, Nazis on the web. And I'm like, yeah, okay. And he was right. I did give the talk at MPA in 2001, Midwestern Psychological Association. It was a packed house. It was a catchy title. Von Hippel knew his business, right? And that's the beauty of grad school. You get to learn a lot. But here's some pieces of it. We're going to go to the website. Well, not actually. And one of the websites we used was stormfront.org. It still exists. And it is a website that promotes these ideas. So some of this content is pulled straight from Stormfront, right? Properly cited. The question is, what is racism? And many of us might deal with this question. Well, what is racism? And I'm going to give you a really simple definition of racism. Racism is when we use race to explain an observation. So we observe something in our world and we want to explain what we've observed. If we use race as an explanation, we are engaging at that point in racism. All right. I used race to explain an observed phenomenon. I'm engaging in racism. Does that make me a racist? I'm going to say not yet. But if someone chronically uses race to explain their world, then I think they've earned the label racist. All right. A racist uses racism to understand their world. For those of us who want to stop using race as an explanation, then we're engaging in less and less racism and moving further and further away from the label racist. So it's not necessarily a pejorative term the way I'm explaining it. It's just a term that accounts for observed processing, mental processing. Now, on Stormfront, they say that the racist double standard. Whites are made to feel guilty and hateful for loving their own people and culture. And one of the premises of Stormfront, they say, is, look, this is not a website about hate. White supremacists are not about hate. They're about love. They're about love of their own. But that's love of their own over the love of others, right? So it becomes an interesting issue, and it was one that we didn't necessarily believe. And one of the reasons we engaged in this research project, hello, Annika, is to see if this is the case. Is this website a promoter of love, or is this website a promoter of hate, or is it some combination of both, and how can we determine that, right? So we are racialists, is what people say on Stormfront, and I don't buy into that. I'm sorry. Racists, racialists. You can funny with the terms, but it means the same thing. It doesn't mean the same thing to them, right? Because they see race as a pejorative. They see racialist as an intelligent response to their world. Again, supported by their narrative. Hi, Electron. We got a big party going on here. I think Annika's working on knocking my coffee over onto the computer, is what I see going there. So, the 14 words, and they say these are our core value. The 14 words, and this is for white supremacists, we must secure the existence of our people and a future for our children. For our white children. Now, who is on this website? Well, it would be a stereotype to say it's just white supremacists. There was white supremacists, right? There are Nazis. There are white separatists, right? There are white nationalists, and these are all slightly different in their philosophies. So it's a large number of subgroups that participate on this website, right? So folks on the site say they're not putting others down. That was their thing. They state they have a preference from their own, and that's where they come from. And we just said, well, we can put that to a test, because we looked at the website, and the fascinating thing about a lot of websites that maintain discussion forums, discussion boards, etc., is they plainly indicate, how a discussion forum works, just like our discussion boards. You put in a topic, right? And in these cases, in this type of website, what happens is people put a topic header, right? And then you click on that topic header and it opens up their message. Well, the website quantifies things marvelously for us. It quantifies the number of times it was clicked, that is the number of times it was read. And it also then threads the responses so we can count the number of responses. Note how we're going to operationalize interest in a particular narrative on the basis of how many times was it read and how many responses did it receive. Our operationalization of interest then, right, is this post interesting? What constitutes an interesting post on Stormfront is the number of times it's read and the number of responses it receives. So this is how we operationalize an aspect of interest in the real world, or the virtual world, if you will. The general idea then, as you might be seeing unfolding here, is if a message says white pride, that is, hey, we're about how much we love our own, how many reads does that message get, as opposed to a message that says these other people suck, and how many reads does it get? Overall then, what we should see, if it really is about pride and it really is about the positive, we should see the preponderance of attention, interest, placed towards positive messages about the white race, and relatively few messages that derogate outgroups, that is negativity. So this is something that's testable, right? And it's testable with the data that the website generates in and of itself that's available to everyone. One benefit to this website is that they have an archive of messages. So we were able to download all the messages that were posted on all the boards in a given month, right? We would download them once a month. So we sat there and we researched what was being done on this website for a period of 6 months, so we got a feel for what they do, and we could do some dandy correlational research. So the observed narratives then over the period of 6 months, right? We have the discussion board posts, the replies were downloaded. Each month's messages were coded for the category of the narrative, and then each month's messages were coded for emotional content. We assess these correlations, content by emotion, and the narratives were found and verified as a result of this. What type of research do you think we're doing at this point in time, you guys? Correlational and archival, because we're using records, right? So what did we find as a result of this kind of pre-work? And this is where we use one type of research, correlational archival, to kind of establish that the phenomenon exists, and now we're going to get more in depth about the phenomenon itself. The three narratives that emerged: Jewish control of the banking, the media, the universities. That is the general story that Jews have power in all these areas and control what we see, how our money is loaned and gains interest, and have control of the academic process. And therefore, they believe that Jews have a tremendous ability to indoctrinate people via the university system. And we can see that often authoritarian regimes really disfavor education, and often the first thing they do is, the Germans went in and they cleaned out the university system in the 1930s Germany. When the Soviets and the Germans got into Poland, University of Warsaw, let's get there and let's first people they murder the professors because they got big mouths and they like to think and they challenge ideas, none of which is amenable to authoritarian regimes. So the Jewish control of these areas was one of the narratives that was continually advanced on the white supremacist website. The other was concerning blood and the purity of race, right? And the general idea is that we need to keep the white race pure, that somehow white blood and black blood are different. So we're going to keep those separate for the betterment of the white race. We're not going to allow the white race to be diminished as a result of interbreeding with other peoples. This is the fancy term for this is miscegenation or race mixing. And then we did observe, as was true to their word, white pride messages as well. Now the idea here is we can now put a number to the proportion of each of these messages so we want. But we're going to move to experimental research, or at least quasi-experimental research. That is, it's quasi-experimental because we're not in a laboratory. We don't have random assignment to conditions, which is necessary to call it a true experimental research. Quasi-experimental research backs off on some of the stringency of the requirements because it's not possible to do in a real-world environment necessarily. So we try to adhere to experimental method as much as possible within the context we're operating. So before we get going here, first step, 1 month of messages download before experiment. Let's just verify where we're at. 1 month introductory period for the experimenters, so we establish new identities and we put them in there and allow people to see us operating on the website and come to recognize us. Right? We insert 2 stimulus messages then from here every 7 days on Wednesday. Why Wednesday? Because we've got the data to show that the greatest number of reads are for messages that are inserted on Wednesday, right? So we want to hold that constant. And what we're talking about here when we talk about quasi-experiment, we control what we can. Right? And message insertion time is one thing that we could control. We had 3 different types of messages times 2, so we got 6 messages. We made sure not to put the same types of messages in the same week. So we don't do 2 miscegenation messages in the same week. We do miscegenation and a pride, for example. And that's just good experimental design. Now we're able to count the number of reads, number of replies, code replies, so more on the dependent variables. It's already tracked number of times read, number of responses. We're going to take this as an operationalization of interest. Right? Again, we content code for the narrative, and then we do the emotion coding as well. So let's take a look. The prototypic messages that we're going to insert fit these categories. White pride, there's 2 white pride messages. One references a Jewish outgroup, the other a black outgroup, right? And then we have a black-white miscegenation message, and we have Jewish control of the media message. These are narrative consistent messages, 4 messages in all. I'll get to the other types of messages here in just a minute. So, example of a prototypic message, Jewish media control. This is the message we inserted. Remember how the website works. You put a message in, what do people see? Jewish control of the media. If that interests them, they'll click on it, and then they can read it and perhaps reply to it. So, the topic said Jewish control of the media. You click on it, what do you read? Well, if I see one more Jew news anchor on TV, I will scream. But it's not just the news. The documentary shows are just as bad. Part of me is worried, but a bigger part of me is just mad that Jews control so much of the news. And now we just wait, and we count the number of responses, and we count the number of reads, right? But this is a straight-up narrative supporting message. Notice, this is no new information to them. Basically, what I've done is take the overall average of their messages and simply reworded it and presented it back to them, which is what the website does continuously. Now let's look at an example, a prototypical example of miscegenation. Black Swan or women is the header, the topic line, and then click on that, you read the message. These white Negro couples make me sick. I was at an Indians game, and who sat right down in front of me? But a good-looking and obviously pregnant white girl with a Negro. Just writing about it makes my skin crawl all over again. What's wrong with these white women? Notice, we have all the components here. We have the visceral response, makes my skin crawl, right? We have the observation of the miscegenation taking place. Now, where it starts to get interesting is when we start looking at the responses. To what extent do they confirm the narrative, right? Notice before we did the archival correlational analysis, but now in quasi-experimental research, we've inserted a stimulus, and now we get to observe the response. So we've kind of upped the research game, if you will, into kind of a more causal or explanatory than just simply an observational. So this response. Well, Black Swan or women, that was our topic line. Someone had clicked that topic, then they posted this response. I don't think it's so much the woman's fault as it is the great Jewish-controlled media. They portray blacks as great men and as ideal. I see the same thing, and it makes me want to puke. And we're like, oh, okay. Wow, I didn't expect to create a message about black-white miscegenation and have a response interjecting the Jewish narrative. But notice the Jewish narrative supports the miscegenation. So we're getting this amazing picture of how narratives, 2 separate narratives within the same website, have been woven together to be mutually supportive of each other. Absolutely fascinating discovery, we thought, right? Now, The two messages that I've, said I would talk about here in a minute, well, it's that minute now. And what we did then is, what happens if we screw the narrative up? What happens if we reverse the narrative? What happens if we present an incorrect narrative according to what we have observed on the website? So he said, well, why not put out a message about Jewish and white race mixing, Jewish and white miscegenation, and then we'll flip it around as well that black control the media, neither of which are supported narratives. What happens when you put an unsupported narrative into the website? Well, it got a lot of clicks, that's for sure. And the example of the reverse prototypic message, blacks taking over the media. So whether it's magazines, the kids' school books, the newspaper, it seems like it's all being taken over by the blacks. Whether it's about history or what's happening now, it just keeps getting blacker. When did blacks take over all the writing? Well, this is truly a violation of their narrative, so what is the response? Well, we were taken aback, and I didn't expect this, and that's probably part of good research, is you find things that you don't necessarily expect. So remember, the topic was black takings over the media. Now, the respondent here is referring to African Americans, but in such a way that I didn't feel comfortable presenting it, either in the talk I gave nor now. So let's just say that African Americans can't even feed or govern themselves. They're no more behind the conspiracy you speak of than any other, but there's a mind control war raging for sure. Oy vey. And if you're up on your Yiddish, oy vey is an exclamation like, oh well, or oh my, or oh surprise. So what obviously this person is saying, look, hey brother, and there was a courteous part in the beginning of the message that really started out, hey brother, hate to correct you, but, and then he corrected me on the narrative by this way saying, no, blacks aren't even capable of controlling the media, but the Jews in fact are. So we see that when we violate a narrative, we're not necessarily thrown off the group, but when we violate a narrative, we're corrected to adopt the proper narrative of the way they believe the world works. So I hope that we've gotten an idea kind of the power of narratives and how narratives do conform to the beliefs as possession. They're tightly held. They're endowed with a level of accuracy because they are our narratives, right? And then let's take it back to image theory. And if we want to tie this to image theory, then if we look at the white supremacists and they view the outgroup Jews, the image that they're likely to generate as a result of their narratives is the Jews are the enemy. The emotion elicited then is going to be anger and hatred, and the subsequent action tendency is likely going to be attack, right? And we saw this in Nazi Germany, where attacks were increasingly violent against the Jews as a result of the narrative that the Nazis used to shift German opinion about Jews. And then for African American as a group, we see the white supremacists might be more likely to view them as barbarians. And that is where we see a greater level of fear and avoidance, and the action tendency then might be segregation. So in tying narratives to all of the previous things we've talked about in class, and then ultimately to the emotions and the action tendencies that result of this. So that's about it for this one. Anyway, Penelope's happy to have her cone off, and you can see she's looking pretty good. And she certainly loves sharing this time with you as much as I do. So take care, and we'll see you in a little bit.